We imagine reality to be colourful because we know life is not black and white. Colour illuminates the path by providing a map of consciousness through energising us so we can experience the unseen world and embody all of who we are becoming. This is episode 3 of our podcast, Colourful Conversations. And today we really want to focus a bit more on the book, which is why you can see it right in the middle of the table. And in particular, to help you understand, when we talked about in episode 1, the conditioned self, what does that mean in terms of how are things playing out in the world today? So when we originally wrote the book in 2015, we talked a lot about post 2008 when there was the financial crisis. And obviously in writing the second edition, we've just come through a worldwide pandemic, and that's had a massive knock-on effect in the way that we see the world, with increased mental health issues and many other things. So we would like to spend this episode having a conversation really about what does the old paradigm look like and what is the new story that's emerging. And if that whets your appetite, we invite you to read the book, because we go into a lot more detail about that in the first chapter.
So I think that old paradigm, let's start here.
Yeah.
Based around a post-industrial world, based around a mechanistic model where essentially, we made things back in those days, and it was about conforming, wasn't it? And it was about propping up a system. And so the education system really supported the world of business. And it's become outdated now because it's not working for us anymore, is it? Because in the main, our economy in the West is a knowledge economy. We don't make that much anymore, do we?
No, and I think that brings us into, what the focus has been on, how we've dealt with that is to focus on how can we be more efficient. So we've got, computers that work faster, they're smaller. I'll always remember Steve Jobs standing on a stage, sticking a laptop into an envelope, which was at the time revolutionary. And now we've got, mini computers on our phones. And that's created a whole host of other problems of young people in particular spending far too much time in the virtual world as opposed to the material world. And so the focus was on efficiency, and that didn't give us what we needed. Just because we've got access to, people 24/7, that actually led to more burnouts in many cases. And there's been famous incidences of that. So we really, there is a yearning for the new story. And as again, we've said in previous episodes, we're seeing glimmers of that new story. So you mentioned just now, Kath, the education system. What struck me when we were revisiting all of the data and verifying whether it was still accurate was the huge increase in young people that are leaving the education system because it's their way, it's a very Indigo way actually, of saying, no, this doesn't work for me and I'm not going to put up with this, and challenging the existing system because it's, as we said, broken and outdated. And it's interesting in that concept, the reaction that has had. So people are like, well, this is a massive problem because they're not getting properly educated, because there's a perception of what education is, which is about increased qualifications, going to university, getting a degree.
But it's playing into the old paradigm, isn't it? And I think that's what you're hinting at here, or what you're suggesting, that there are those that are already choosing to move away from the old system, the old way of being, and that mechanistic model. And I mean, I see that in business as well. I mean, we know, don't we, through the work that we've done through our consultancy, that 70% of all change projects fail because they focus on the process. They're not focusing on actually changing people's perceptions at that deeper level, or at least the cultures are pervasive, and so the system tends to perpetuate whether we realize it or not.
And that was one of the reasons, we'd never had many rules, but we had one, which was we would only work with an organisation if we could work with the CEO and their top team, because we know it's all about modelling the new, modelling what you want something to be, because as you do that, then people, if you think about children, they don't do what you say, they act out how mimic you are. So if you're shouting at them, they'll probably shout back at you, even if there's good reason for that, or you got frustrated. So that's the piece,
the beingness, and the world of the old paradigm has been too heavily focused on the doing, without an appreciation or a full appreciation for the full impact of the being. And of course that's manifested itself through many, many stories of leaders being exposed over the last decade or so.
Well, as we talk about in our book, I think it was our Red leader, Fred the Shred, is a typical example of doing, and the greed that you can see, like Gordon Gekko in Wall Street. You can never have enough. And the people that were asked, and people that already were wealthy, well, only when I've got the next deal or what have you. It's that sort of thing. And when we have that, then it kind of implodes, which is what happened to Fred the Shred. And we're seeing that in more and more places. And it brings us back to, because a lot of our work also relates to archetypes, is many people will get excited about this idea of creation. What are we creating? But in order to create, as we were sort of hinting at in the last episode when we talked about the tower bottle,
the old stuff's got to go.
You've got to destroy things. There's got to be destruction so that there's space for the new shoots and the new growth of green.
So I think both of those things are being played out at once, aren't they? We're seeing death of the old, but we're also seeing the emergence of the new. And I think, again, if we look at business post-pandemic, we can see that trend. People for the first time ever had that chance, didn't they, to sit and to have some space and to get out in nature and to reconnect with their families and to take up hobbies that they'd always wanted to do but never had the time or the means to make it happen. And all of a sudden, that began to emerge. And so they didn't want to go back to the old world or the old way of being, the old way of business. And I think we've seen human, or at least the idea that, work should be about flourishing. It should be about utilizing your potential. And yet, it's been more around the area of resourcing. But it's changing, it's shifting. And I think people are voting with their feet, aren't they?
Yeah, so what we're seeing, and if we take that example you've given, is more hybrid working. Yeah. So people living where they want to live, not where the work is, and insisting that
and
they
mass
can work,
exodus
can
into
work
the
from
country.
home at least part of the week, if not the whole week. And so then office or companies are responding by going, actually, do we need all this square footage of office space? No, we don't. We could save money by having a smaller office. So all of that attempts at sort of remote working that sort of worked, sort of didn't in the kind of the old way. It's always that we've got to trust people because they're not coming back, and we need,
Or we don't have any more control. And I think that's the big shift, isn't it? And control is breaking down. Yeah. And people are being liberated from not only their old ways of being and the ways of thinking, but actually processes are changing. And I think there's both a positive and a negative of technology. And certainly we're in that world now of where we're going. We're moving into the world of artificial intelligence. That's going to liberate even more. But again, there's going to be ramifications and consequences. We need people, particularly leaders, don't we, to be able to understand fully and act compassionately and ethically around how they be with all of that.
So that goes back to what we were saying, or I was hinting at when I was saying with the focus has been on efficiency, whereas really what we need within the education system and the workplace is more acceptance or understanding that it's really about compassion, empathy, and kindness. And those are the qualities that need to be developed. And how do we go around about developing those and helping people to build those muscles? Because that's what makes us different from machines.
Yeah.
And then your point, I think, about AI is really interesting in the sense that because it's a bit like religion is created by, by people, so it's limited because if it's coming from that human space, you can't see everything that's available. And we're already seeing that play out with AI. And so the question one almost has to, because it's more about the questions than the answers in some respects, is, well, if we constrict where something can go, where what fields AI can go into, or, explore, what are we creating? If something feels constricted, it feels like it's a slave. And what do slaves do? They rebel.
Yeah. And of course, we're seeing some aspects of that in Europe with the farmers in Germany and France, and people all over the world actually standing up and saying, no, I've had enough now.
And it also goes back to what you were also saying when you said, absolutely, finger on the pulse, talking about it's all about the breakdown of control. When helping people to understand the impact of colour, in our book, we developed 8 business principles that touched on the different energies within each colour, or different aspects of each colour attributes. And when we're talking about gold, which actually interestingly sits behind indigo, the principle was let go of control and allow all the voices in the system to be heard, because that allows for true, authentic power, which comes back full circle to what we were talking in the last episode when we were looking at the energy of 8 and abundance and power.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think equally sitting behind this magenta bottle is olive green. And you were talking about kindness and compassion and understanding, and that's feminine leadership in action. And so that really hints at the bigger question, isn't it? Of why do businesses exist? Do they exist purely to make money and profit? Of course, there's got to be an aspect of that. But if that goes to the extreme, that's an imbalanced business that over the long haul is going to fall out of love, really, or is going to, should I say, customers, employees are going to, and stakeholders are going to fall out of love with that business.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to when we were talking about the models of business. So in a sense, this idea of having shareholders and creating dividends, the purpose of that initially, I believe, was to help people, it was to create a form of accountability, so that it wasn't just down to what's happening in the organisation, but we've taken that in the old paradigm to extremes, so that, PLCs operate almost a very short term, on a quarter to quarter basis. What's going to give me more profit? So I've got something to give back to the shareholders, and have forgotten, with corporate amnesia, what the whole point of having shareholders was in the first place.
So we're moving into this new space, and this space is unknown, and I know most people talk, don't they, about it, this world being volatile and uncertain and complex. And ambiguous. But actually what we all need is a compelling vision. And I was reminded when you were talking about when we get this expanded sense of self. You talked about that in episode 2. And you said that, and then people can contract because they go back into their families. So firstly, we need this expanded sense of a vision for our futures, don't we? That's both at a collective level, but at an individual level.
Yeah, it's sort of like Martin Luther King. He didn't actually say, I have a plan.
No.
He said, I have a dream.
Yeah.
And that's the key, dreaming our world into being, which, as you say, is through that indigo sense. And the fact that I think what is part of the magenta energy is this idea that there is a gestation period. We dream it into being, and sometimes things happen pretty instantly, but most of the time there's a like when we get pregnant, it's 9 months normally before we give birth to a baby. So there's the gestation period, and in that period we have to keep feeding the dream. Just as if you have a baby, you don't feed it once. When it's really small, you're feeding it every 4 hours. And similarly with a dream, it's kind of keeping that excitement alive. And that links back to, I suppose, what the essence of this is, how do we have more aliveness in our world? And in fact, most people there's a huge amount of passivity because they think what they want is comfortability or comfort, but I always think of that as being comfortably numb, which comes to your point from episode 1 about the language of emotions. What are they, and what do they represent?
Yeah. And in a universe of energy, as I said then, thoughts are electric and feelings are magnetic. So it's so important to work on these higher emotional states. And that's, as I'm hearing, it's not about ignoring what we're feeling in any given moment, but it's allowing those feelings to flow through and out.
Yeah, so it comes back to, do you remember when we were doing more of our consultancy work together, we came up with a model, didn't we, which was that most people do in order to have, and there might be a tiny little bit for being at the end of all that doing and having, which is why they feel empty, which is what we both felt in different ways and made those changes. Whereas actually it really starts with that inner knowingness, that still voice of calm, which comes from the reflective space, as you were talking about the properties of blue, and from the knowingness that, which is also that sort of essence of ourselves, comes the being, and then that informs the doing.
Yeah. And that is that the decisions that we make then come from a much better place, and that gives us a leap in consciousness. And that brings us back full circle to where we started this conversation in episode 1. So I think that's probably enough for us to talk about today.
Yeah, there's one thing I just want to add and I agree with you in principle, is it links back to what we were talking about, I think in episode 1, about intuitive intelligence. And what we're building here is discernment. So we're not anti-discernment, judgment in that sense of discerning who are the people I want to have in my life, what are the things that I want to be doing, and being in that place, which comes from a honed intuition as opposed to judging what is happening in our life. And that helps people to understand that move from it's happening to me to it's happening as me. And that's the whole point. And as you say, that kind of neatly concludes the episode. So if you're wondering what's coming next, for the remaining episodes in this series 1 of our podcast, we have selected individual leaders and scientists and people that have a different take on colour to come and spend time, or consciousness maybe, to come and spend time with us and explore that.
Ordinary people living extraordinary lives. So we can't wait to share that with you. Magic happens in any given moment. All it takes is us to be aware and present and open to what wants to unfold. Our intention is always to enable you to see more, perceive more, and be more.